Grab a snack, grab a coffee, grab onto your horses because today we're going to talk about the worst books that I read in 2021. So I feel like these videos always have to come with a disclaimer that just because these books were not for me primarily, or because I didn't enjoy them as much as I could have, that doesn't mean that they don't have some sort of literary value or that they can't be meaningful for other people. They're just books that just didn't work for me for a particular set of reasons, and we're all different types of readers. There's a reader out there for every book. I truly believe that. These books were just not for me. So that being said, I do have 4 particular books that I just didn't really like in 2021. By the way, these are in no particular order. So why don't we get in the hot seat and start off with a hot take. So one of the worst books that I read in 2021 is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I feel like I've actually been kind of vocal about my dislike for The Midnight Library. And it's an interesting book because I actually kind of sort of enjoyed the ride. Like when I read it, I was like, oh, you know, it's fine. Like it wasn't a book that I hated right off the bat. It was one that over time I started to hate and that I really didn't like. And so The Midnight Library is a contemporary fantasy or a literary fantasy. You can even call it magical realism if you want. And in this book, we have a library that exists between death and life, and there is an infinite amount of books that can represent an infinite amount of realities that you could have lived. And so in this one, we're specifically following our main character, Nora, who is extremely depressed, extremely suicidal. There's just nothing seems to go right in her life, and she ends up in this midnight library after attempting to commit suicide. And really in the whole book, she gets to sample all of these realities and all of a sudden wake up and realize that her life has meaning and that she just wasn't appreciating her life in the way that she should have. And that's really the reason that I didn't really enjoy this book. It's already a cliche book. It's literally filled with so many cliches, like if only you do better. So really it's a gift wrapped fiction book trying to be a non-fiction motivational book, but also I found it to be slightly problematic. I am someone who deals with depression ever since I was a very young girl, and really not to like go, I don't want to go into it a lot, but when I was younger I did try to commit suicide at some point because I was just miserable. And I felt like back then if I would have read something like this, it just wouldn't have helped. If anything, it would have made me feel more depressed. Really the message that I got from this book, and maybe other people got something completely different, but basically the message it gives is if you appreciated life more, or if you made choices, or if you made different choices, then you would be happy and you wouldn't be depressed. And that's not the reality of depression. That's not really a message you want to give to someone who is struggling that bad in life. Like if only you had made different choices. Like I said, I think it's a slightly problematic message, and because of that, it's a no for me. The second book on this list is one that just left me emotionally drained. This book made me realize that I have certain triggers, and I think I'll want to avoid them in the future, or at least know about them before going in. But this book is The House of Ashes by Stuart Noville. And this is a crime mystery novel that takes place in Northern Ireland, and it's written by an Irish author. Now this one could have also been on my most disappointing books of the year because this was pitched for fans of Tana French, and I love Tana French. I read In the Woods. It's one of the best books that I read in 2021. Spoiler alert. And I thought that I was really going to enjoy this one, and no, I was emotionally depleted, emotionally drained by the end of this book. I had to stop reading for like 2 weeks because I couldn't do anything because it just left me drained. Stuart Noville is not a bad writer. The writing was actually really good. It was very easy to read and very easy to digest, and he can tell a story. House of Ashes is told in a dual timeline, and we are following one of our main characters. Her name is Sarah. She is married to this horrible, abusive person who gaslights her, mentally abuses her, and just keeps her trapped. So she's basically trapped in this marriage and in this home. They're trying to have a fresh start and they move from, I believe it's England to Northern Ireland, where she has no connections, no family. She's basically alone. And one of the first nights that they get there, there's this woman that shows up at the house covered in blood, and she's like, hey, this is my house, I live here. And we find out that she is the previous owner of the house, who now lives in like a retirement home. And so from there we start to learn that 6 years in the past there was this murder that happened at the house, and no one really ever found out exactly what happened. Sarah becomes really intrigued with that story and what happens, and so she starts to visit Mary at her retirement home, and Mary starts to share her story about what happened. And that premise sounds so good to me. It's just a great setup for everything that I love in mystery thrillers and just like crime novels. And so I thought I was really going to enjoy it. But there's just so much explicit violence against women. Like I said, there's a lot of mental and verbal abuse, a lot of gaslighting, and there's just so much of it that I felt emotionally drained by the end of it. And I get it, you know, some stories are going to be emotionally challenging, and that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to be told. I just don't know why we have this man writing about violence towards women in such a heavy and very emotionally draining way. I just feel like there could have been a way for Stuart Neville to tell the story without it being so explicit, you know? And so for that, it ended up being one of the worst books that I read in 2021 because it threw me into a depressive episode that lasted a couple of weeks, and I couldn't even read anything. So there's that one. This next one is also going to be a little bit controversial. And before I say the title of this next book, I just wasn't the target audience. And this is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Now, this year I started, the second half of the year at least, I started reading a lot of horror. And Grady Hendrix, he's a really popular author within the horror genre. So I was like, okay, it's time to try out Grady Hendrix. And I was disappointed, to say the least. I guess this is another one that could have gone on my most disappointing books of 2021, but I decided to put it in this category. And that's just because I wasn't the target audience, and so this book didn't really do anything for me. It was very mediocre in my opinion as a book. I do have to say that this would make an excellent movie. Like, if it was a movie, I would watch it, and I think I would really enjoy it. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Grady Hendrix is a screenwriter, or he writes screenplays. So that makes sense. It felt very movie-esque, and I wish it would have been a movie, or maybe it is being made into a movie. Who knows? I don't know, because I haven't looked into it. And so My Best Friend's Exorcism is set in 1988, and we follow two very unlikely friends, Abby and Gretchen, and they have been friends since childhood until Gretchen starts to act a little bit sus. And Abby starts to think that she might be possessed by a spirit. And really, that's the entire premise of this book. There is a lot of 80s references. If you're an 80s flower child, I think you'll really like this. I am a 90s baby, and I am not obsessed with 80s culture. Not only that, but it's filled with a lot of 80s white middle class culture, which I think is a big distinction. We like to think of the 80s as this very homogenous period, but no, it's filled with 80s white culture, which as a 90s baby and as a Latina, there was nothing for me to relate to. I didn't understand the references. I didn't think it was this like really cool retro book. It was just a very bland story that read very young. It was just very meh for me. It was very long. I listened to it as an audiobook, so I actually don't know the page count of this book, but it was excessively long. I don't think it needed to be that long. The last book on this list for the worst books that I read in 2021 is Finna by Nino Cipri, and this is the first installment in Littenverse. I believe this might be a series, and this is a sci-fi book, and I felt like this book was also everything that I think I wanted. It's sapphic, there are portals, it's set in an IKEA sort of place, and I just thought I was really gonna love it. I thought this was going to be the comedic sapphic romance that I needed during the time that I was reading this, and it just failed to be that. And I think where this book really failed for me is in the character relationships. I just wanted a little bit more depth, and I wanted a little bit more spark between our main character and her ex. I wish there would have been something more. It just felt very dry to me. And the premise of this book is, I honestly could barely remember, but we're in this store that is sort of like an IKEA, and there's these portals that open up, and one of the customers ends up going through this portal, and so our main character and her ex are sort of like bunched together to go find this lady who got trapped. And oh, that's another thing that I just remembered. It's also supposed to be like this critique of capitalism and the way that workers are treated. And I like that part of it. I just think that the author could have further analyzed all of this in a very witty and a very creative way, but that's just not what I felt, and it's not what I got. I think part of it maybe is that it was written as a novella, and so as a novella there wasn't enough room to explore all of these different dynamics. Ultimately the book just felt flat for me. So those were the worst books that I read in 2021. I didn't want to try to give you a list of 5 or a list of 10 books if there weren't. You know, there were some books that were disappointing, which I will talk about in a different video, but they weren't the worst books that I've read. They're just mediocre, and so we'll talk about those on another episode of how much can I piss people off with books that I don't like. Thanks for watching. If you like my channel, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It'll really help me out, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.